Hello all, I am Dr. Kathy Skott-Myhre, and I am the person behind the curtain. Personally, I find it a little odd to work with someone online without actually knowing who they are, seeing their face, or seeing them live. So I'm going to do my best to occasionally make a video, perhaps do a Google Hangout. I haven't tried that yet. You guys might be a good experiment. So that you know that there's actually a real live person sitting behind her computer working alongside of you and monitoring your progress. I also have a graduate assistant by the name of James Williams. He posted an introductory statement on the discussion board along with your introductions. So if you haven't already done so, find James Williams and read his introduction and you'll have a little better idea of who he is. I am pleased to see that most of you made it through the first day fairly unscathed in spite of the glitch that we had with the confidentiality and privacy statement. I worked with ITS all through the day today. Well, that would be yesterday because I'm filming this on Monday, but you're going to be seeing it on Tuesday, so for you it'll be yesterday. I worked with them and didn't come to any sort of a conclusion, so I will try to get that information to you somehow. I'm just not quite sure how I'm going to do it yet. I'm working on that tonight. It's probably going to be there for you by the time you see this video. Now, as I mentioned in the orientation model, this is going to be a very fast-paced course, so it's going to be really up to you to keep up with the readings and keep up with the discussions and everything else. Because it is a fairly quick course, it's going to be intense, but it'll be over with before you know it. Hang in there with me and we will get through this together. If you have any questions, please contact me through the D2L email address rather than my campus email. I get sometimes over 100 emails a day from various colleagues and university announcements, etc. And student emails can get lost in the shuffle. So if you email me through D2L, your email is I'm probably going to answer you almost immediately because I check on those throughout the day. I want you to take a good look at your syllabus, and if you have any questions, please make sure that you ask me them at the start because it's sometimes hard to catch up, in the middle or towards the end if you didn't understand something in the syllabus. As far as how you're going to be graded, in your syllabus you will see that you have a discussion or attendance. I think it's actually called attendance. Your attendance is going to be your post in the discussion board. Now, every day for each chapter, you're going to get a prompt, and it might be in the form of a question. It might be asking for you to do some sort of a discussion. Your attendance or your post is going to either be you answering the prompt or perhaps responding to one of your fellow students within that discussion board. So you can actually have a discussion. You don't necessarily just have to answer the questions. You might just be responding to somebody else's post. We're going to be having 3 exams. The first 2 are going to be non-cumulative, which means that you are going to be tested on those things right up until that particular test. Then we're going to start from square one, and then you're going to be taking exam 2. Now, the final exam is going to be cumulative, which means that we're going to be covering everything that we did in the entire semester. I will tell you that most students who do these faster courses, either Maymester or over the summer, because it's such a compact time, they tend to do a little bit better on the final exams, the cumulative exams, than students who've had a whole semester to kind of forget what they've learned, from the very beginning. So you've kind of got an advantage in that regard. Again, if you have any questions about the syllabus, please do contact me via D2L. I don't have actual office hours. That may change. What I do is I do check very frequently throughout the day to make sure that nobody has emailed me. There might be another way that I'm going to post later about how to get a hold of me if you need to contact me for office hours or something like that. But just stay tuned. That being said, please do pay attention to the news items because a lot of information that gets brought up in the middle of the term is going to be posted on the news item and the news feed. Sometimes I have students who ask the same question repeatedly, and no, have many students who ask the same question. And so rather than answering individual emails, I might just post in the news item. Much like today with the problems with the confidentiality and privacy statement, I finally just gave a blanket response to all of that in the news item. So please pay attention to that and check on that regularly throughout this course. What I'd like to do right now is just give you a very brief introduction to Chapter 1. Now, Chapter 1 is essentially going to be a very brief overview of the history of psychopathology and abnormal psychology, as well as some of the future conceptions of abnormal psychology. Most specifically, it introduces the concept of abnormal behavior and gives you some definitional components, how we're actually thinking about abnormal or abnormal psychology or psychopathology today. It also describes the science of psychopathology, outlines some of the primary professions in the field, and terms for understanding psychological disorders. It's going to go through the supernatural, biological, and psychological models of abnormal behavior in the historical context, as well as moving forward into the future. Now, it summarizes kind of a multidimensional approach to psychopathology, and it talks about an integrative approach. And that's what this book that you're going to be reading is actually based in. It's called An Integrative Approach to Psychopathology. And essentially what that means is we're not just going to look at specifically what in the body causes somebody to have depression. What's the chemical makeup in the brain that causes bipolar disorder? We're actually going to be looking at what we call the biopsychosocial model. And that means that we're going to be looking at, is there something that's biologically predetermining somebody to have some sort of psychopathology? If so, what might that be? We're also going to look at some of the mental processes or the psychological processes that might contribute to psychopathology, as well as some of the sociological aspects of psychopathology. What is it about a particular culture, about a particular family makeup, about a particular either urban or suburban or other environment that might contribute to someone's struggles, someone's depression, someone's bipolar disorder, etc. We are going to be looking at what we actually call a disorder or what is abnormal. And this is, of course, all going to be outlined in your book. We're going to be looking at, again, the supernatural tradition, as well as the biological tradition, the psychological tradition, and then, again, wrapping it all up into a more multidimensional approach. Now, according to your text, now your text, by the way, is one way to look at psychopathology. And this is the one that is probably the most familiar to the majority of mental health services. That includes if you're going into nursing, if you're going into criminology, if you're going into social work, if you're going into psychology, if you're going into youth work, or any of those professions. They're all going to kind of conceptualize psychopathology in a similar sort of way, and that's the way we're going to be taking a look at it in this book. There are many other ways to actually think about and conceptualize psychopathology, and hopefully as we move forward, I'll be able to give a little bit of that in some video context. The book, again, is a little bit more traditional. However, this book does incorporate a bit more of the complexities of psychopathology than some other books that I've encountered. So, according to the book, a psychological disorder is psychological dysfunction within an individual that's associated with distress or impairment in functioning and a response that is not typical or culturally expected. Now, all three of these basic criteria must be met. No one criterion alone has yet been identified to define the essence of abnormality. Now, when we're talking about distress or impairment, there's two different ways that we can look at this. It's both within the individual as well as how it affects other people. For example, someone who is experiencing mania or a manic episode. Now, mania or a manic episode is an extreme episode of heightened elation, oftentimes grandiose thoughts, racing thoughts. It's the high part of the bipolar disorder. This person might not need any sleep. They believe that they have the cure for cancer. They have all kinds of, grandiose plans, and they're just kind of running as though they are on some sort of methamphetamines or something like that. I mean, that's essentially what a manic episode looks like. For the person who's experiencing the manic episode, it might actually seem almost pleasurable to them, but for people around them, they're going to experience them as extreme. So that's what I mean by how the individual experiences distress versus how other people might experience distress. And I think that that's also outlined in your book. We're also going to look at the appropriateness of this distress to the situation. For example, if there is a death in the family and someone is grieving that death, it might look like depression. And in our culture, the appropriate response to losing someone is something that looks like depression. It's crying, it's an inability to find pleasure in the things that usually give them pleasure. How long that grief goes on might actually turn grief from something that is a normative reaction into a pathological response. If that grief goes on for longer than 6 months or a year, then that might be a complicated grief process, and we will be getting to that in the book as well. The response is not typical or culturally expected, but we have to look at other things, including how often it happens and how deviant it is from the average or from the norm, or if it's just something that we would call eccentricity. And does it violate cultural norms or social norms? Now, there are certainly exceptions to that. For example, Lady Gaga. Most people don't walk around wearing meat for clothing. Not in our culture. I can't think of any cultures that really do wear meat for clothing. But for Lady Gaga, it wasn't crazy. It wasn't psychopathology. It wasn't pathological. It was her kind of eccentric way of expressing who she is as an artist. As a matter of fact, a lot of things that we accept from some of our celebrities, if they were done by someone in the normal population, that will probably be seen as psychopathology or pathological. The field of psychology is concerned with the scientific study of psychological disorders. Trained mental health professionals range from clinical and counseling psychologists to psychiatrists and psychiatric social workers and nurses. Now, each of these professions requires a very specific sort of training, and there are probably many of you that are doing nursing, criminology, social work, psychology, and there might even be other professions in there that you are moving towards. Each of you is going to have a different sort of training, but we all kind of speak the same sort of language based on the DSM-5. The DSM-5, by the way, is the newest iteration of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for psychiatric and psychological disorders, which is why your book was so unfortunately expensive, because it is a brand new version. The abnormal psychology textbooks are all being rewritten to keep up with the DSM-5. Now, this rewriting hasn't happened in probably 15 years, maybe a little bit longer, which is why it's important to have the most current textbook, and I'm really sorry about the price. So when we're looking at psychopathology, the scientific study of psychopathology, we use scientific methods, and mental health professionals can then function as scientist practitioners. Now, these are the people who sometimes do studies about what causes or what helps in the treatment of a certain psychopathology, but more often than not, then they are actually practitioners. So they use what they learn in their study to apply to working with people who are struggling with psychopathologies. Research about psychological disorders falls into three basic categories. It's a clinical description, which is prevalence, incidence, and course and prognosis; causation, which is etiology; and the treatment outcomes. Prevalence, by the way, is how many people in a population that have a particular disorder. So how often, right now, is somebody struggling with depression? How prevalent is depression in, say, the Carrollton area? Incidence is a number of new cases over a period of time, usually within a year. So what's the incidence of depression in Carrollton for the year 2013 to 2014? So how many new cases of depression have appeared in Carrollton during that period of time? When we're looking at the course of a disorder, for example, depression, we're looking at certain words that I want you to pay attention to. The words that I just gave you, by the way, are words that I also want you to pay attention to. Prevalence and incidence will probably show up on your exams, just a forewarning. The course of a disorder is also something that's going to show up. And the course can be either episodic, meaning that someone can experience depression infrequently or frequently, but it's not kind of a constant, ongoing depression. They might get depressed in the fall, they'll feel better until the holiday season approaches, and then they'll have another bout of depression, and they'll feel better until springtime hits, and they'll never have another bout of depression. That's episodic. Time limited is usually something that tends to resolve itself. Somebody who has grief, for example, might experience time-limited depression. Chronic means that it is something that is ongoing for a long period of time. And we're going to use the example of depression again. Depression is something that you can have a depressive episode, and most people have some sort of resolution from that depressive episode. There is a chronic kind of depression called dysthymia, and that's somebody who has kind of this low-grade depression all the time. Think of Eeyore, if you want to think of somebody who has dysthymia. Eeyore is kind of always walking around very sad because he's lost his tail, and he's, even when you find the tail, it's, no worries, I'm just going to probably lose it again. He's never really happy. That's a chronic sort of low-grade depression, if you will. You also want to look at the onset, and the onset can take two forms. There's an acute onset, which means that, boom, you have depression after the loss of a loved one, and that's an acute onset. There's an insidious onset as well. Insidious means that it's something that just kind of slowly creeps into a person's life. So a person, again, who's struggling with depression might seem okay, but then there's just little things that start kind of wearing away at them, and you notice that that person is just kind of very slowly moving into a state of depression, and that would be insidious. Then you're also going to be looking at prognosis, and prognosis is essentially what's the outcome going to be. And when we're looking at prognosis, the way that we describe it more often than not is either the prognosis is good or it's guarded. We don't often say that the prognosis is bad with psychopathology because people, generally speaking, don't die from psychological illnesses. I say generally because people who do have mental illness sometimes do suicide, or they are engaging in risky behaviors, which can end up in death or bodily harm. But for the most part, you don't die from a mental illness, with the exception, again, of things like disordered eating, and we're going to get to that when we get to that chapter. So in your book, you're going to be looking at the supernatural, biological, and psychological traditions. I'm not going to get into that in detail right now because you are going to look at that in your book. I've got some of that outlined in the PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to leave that to you to look at and use the outlines or the bullet points that I've given you in the PowerPoint to kind of outline your reading and organize your reading. At the end of the chapter, again, it comes down to the idea that we are becoming more increasingly sophisticated with our understanding of psychopathology, and we've got more ways to measure treatment outcomes and so on and so forth. So we are getting a little bit more learned, if you will, about what psychopathology is, what causes it, and how we can in fact treat it. And we're looking at it from a multidimensional, more integrative model. And that is essentially chapter 1, and I wish you the best of luck. I will hopefully be checking back in with you at some point. You might be hearing my voice in voiceovers if I can figure out how to put them into my PowerPoints. I'm kind of new at some of this technology. Bear with me, and I will hopefully see you again soon. Good luck.